last video, we discussed the rise of the classical West as a product of encounters between two great civilizations, the Greek city-states of the Hellenic period and the Achaemenid dynasty in Persia. And we ended with a discussion of the shift in the balance of power that resulted from the Persian Wars, meaning that as a result of the Persian Wars, the Achaemenid dynasty would retreat from its incursions into mainland Greece, and you would see the rise of Athens as the predominant polis or city-state in Greece. Athens would translate this power, or translate this rise in power, into a period known as the Golden Age. The Golden Age of Athens was a period in which many of the cultural, literary, philosophical, and architectural foundations of Western civilization would be established. So it's worthwhile to take a few moments to talk about this Golden Age of Athens and understand the contributions made by the city-state until it fell to the Macedonians. So let's start with politics, because one of the chief contributions of the city-state of Athens was the emergence of direct democracy. Athens, in the late Dark Ages and in the early Hellenic period, actually went through all 5 political forms that we discussed in the last video. They went through all 5 political forms that existed in the Greek mainland city-states. And those included monarchy, ruled by a king; oligarchy, ruled by the few; aristocracy, ruled by the nobles or ruled by the elite; democracy, ruled by the people; and tyranny, which is ruled by someone who has seized power illegally. So they've gone through those different stages, but in the Golden Age, they were primarily defined, Athens was primarily defined by direct democracy. That was the political form that was really the most powerful and the longest lived during the Golden Age of Athens. So when we say direct democracy, we mean that decisions were discussed and voted upon by all free Athenian citizens. It's important to note that this concept of all Athenian citizens did exclude most members of the population. It excluded women, for example, children, slaves, freed slaves, resident aliens. So the concept of citizenship in ancient Athens was limited, but it was much broader than you would see in a monarchy, oligarchy, or aristocracy, for that matter. So it becomes an important foundation of some of the political forms that would come to define the modern West. So it's important to kind of look at them and explain and explore what was going on in this Athenian democracy. So Athenian democracy is often attributed, or early Athenian democracy is often attributed to a man named Solon, who would create a couple of institutions that helped to structure Athenian democracy. The first was the boule, or council. The second was the ecclesia, or assembly, town meeting, in which people could discuss and vote on issues of common concern for the city-state. Solon created these institutions as a way of challenging the authority of the aristocrats, specifically the archons who represented the aristocracy. These reforms were picked up by Cleisthenes, who reorganized the tribe-based social structure in Athens, eliminating traditional tribes and replacing them with 10 new tribes. Those tribes were primarily territory-based. They were divided into demies, and the demies were basically like voting districts. So this became a way of organizing society and politics in a democratic format. That allowed adult males to vote, even though it excluded the vast majority of the population. So this form of direct democracy existed in Athens for about 100 years before it was ended by Macedonian conquest. And we'll talk about that story in a few minutes. Another contribution of the Athenians was in the realm of philosophy. The Golden Age of Athens saw the foundation of a number of concerns, a number of issues that would come to define Western philosophy. They sought to discover order and meaning in both nature and in human life, looking for the purpose and meaning of human existence, which would give rise to Western philosophy. It's important to note that many Eastern cultures, particularly in China and India were also grappling with these same sorts of questions. You have, for example, the roughly contemporaneous origins of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, legalism, as philosophies, Eastern philosophies, that attempted to answer many of the same questions. And while traditionally Western and Eastern philosophy have been treated as something completely separate, in which Eastern philosophy focuses on the whole of human existence and Western philosophy focuses on only certain components of human existence, there are some similarities between the two, beyond just time frame. They both grapple with questions of morality, ethics, and virtue, try to find meaning in human existence, try to understand nature. So it's useful at times to look at to sort of compare and contrast these Eastern and Western philosophical traditions as you study world history. But for the purposes of our study of Greek philosophy, we want to look at a few general characteristics, including the fact that the Greeks tended to stress moderation as the key to happiness and fulfillment. They believed that hubris, excessive pride or arrogance, provoked something called nemesis, which was retribution. The Greeks also contributed the foundational belief that man was the measure of all things. This is an approach to philosophy called Humanism. So in the Golden Age of Athens, there were three primary philosophers that historians identify as key to establishing this foundation. The first was Socrates, and Socrates challenged the teachings of a group known as the Sophists. And Sophists stressed the relativity of truth. Socrates disagreed with the Sophists. He disagreed with the concept that truth, with a capital T, could be relative. Instead, he stressed that truth existed and could be understood, and developed a method of teaching through questioning. One of his students, Plato, believed that truth existed, but it existed away from the material world, instead arguing in books like The Republic that it existed in the realm of thought, in the realm of being rather than becoming. And Plato's student Aristotle also believed that truth could be understood, but he believed that truth existed in the material world, said that ideas have no existence outside of the material world. And so the key to philosophy was to accumulate knowledge, to understand the world as it was. Hence Aristotle's writings on a number of topics, including ethics, physics, metaphysics, psychology, linguistics, biology. He wasn't called the encyclopedic philosopher for nothing. In many ways, these three men would provide the foundation of Western philosophical traditions. Another contribution from the ancient Athenians was in the realm of architecture. Greek architecture unified the people of the Eastern Mediterranean. They spread things like temples. You can see these temples in Athens and Delphi. The Stoa, which was a covered walkway for public use, such as this in Athens, or this one in Lindos. The Greeks contributed theaters for public performances, like this one in Epidaurus, or Delphi, or Syracuse, or Ephesus. The Bouleuterion, which was a meeting hall for the Boule, that council, can be seen in Turkey or in Olympia. And whatever the building was, whatever building you're describing, you can see some commonalities of Greek architecture. They relied heavily on columns and what was called entablature. The entablature was what the column supported. And within those columns, you see the development of different architectural styles. There were multiple orders, as they're called in Greek architecture, including the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. The developments or the advances of Greek architecture would be adopted and spread by Alexander the Great throughout the Mediterranean, and would be later adopted by the Romans, who would spread it into Europe and the Western Mediterranean. So in many ways, Athenian and Greek architecture became the foundation of Western architecture. So this golden age of Athens was a period in which Athens contributed a great deal of creativity and a great deal of the basic foundations of the modern West. But the power of Athens also led to problems in Greece. And between 431 and 404 BCE, the Greek city-states erupted in a war, into what might be described as a civil war, but which historians call the Peloponnesian War. Athens had been weakened by the death of Pericles, one of their great leaders. They were opposed by many of the Greek city-states for atrocities committed at Milos, and they were countered by sort of this military alliance led by Sparta. By 404 BCE, after facing a number of embarrassing defeats, Athens capitulated, accepting terms that severely weakened the once great city-state, and more or less establishing mainland Greece under Spartan rule. Spartan rule was accompanied by anarchy and a period of economic depression, all of which would weaken the Greek city-states, weaken the Greek nation-state, and allow for the conquest of the Macedonians. This marks the beginning of a period known as Hellenistic Greece. In the Hellenistic period, the Macedonians rose under Philip II and then conquered much of the Eastern Mediterranean, Asia Minor, Persia, and Egypt under the expansion of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, who ruled from 356 to 323 BCE, spread the Macedonian Empire from Egypt to the Indus River. And his empire was notable not because it lasted. In fact, it didn't long outlast his death. He left no clear heir, and there was a fracturing in this fight for power to control Alexander's empire. But the Hellenistic period, the Macedonian Empire, was important because it blended Western and Eastern traditions. It established a pattern that many historians call the Hellenization of Asia, which refers to the blending of Greek and Asian, or Greek and Eastern traditions. Alexander created elaborate trading networks that connected the eastern and western parts of his empire. All along those trading networks were very cosmopolitan cities that brought different cultures together. They exchanged not just goods, but ideas and traditions and religions as well, resulting in a process called Syncretism, the combining of different beliefs. And in Alexander's empire, he merged Mesopotamian, Persian, Egyptian, Anatolian, and Indian belief systems into a Hellenic framework. And his extensive empire, while it did not outlive him, created this or contributed to the spread of Greek culture from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River, and created a blending of these cultures that would far outlive him. So while the great empires of the classical West would eventually fall, the contributions they made in politics, in philosophy, in architecture, in religion, they endured. And we will see their influence in the Roman, Seleucid, and Mauryan empires that emerged from the fragmented Hellenistic Empire. And that demonstrates that the origins of what we might call the Western tradition is not just in the Greco-Roman world, but in the larger connections between the Mediterranean, Persian, and Indian worlds. Thank you.